Before we jump in, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The old service truck smelled perpetually of wet canvas, pine sap, and the slightly acrid tang of burnt diesel, a comforting bouquet that Elias Thorne associated with the start of every good day. The kind of heavy, wet darkness that presses down on the forest preserve still enveloped the area, promising fog until the sun finally breached the canopy and began to burn it off. Elias eased the tailgate shut. The rusty latch gave a familiar metallic clunk that the oppressive silence of the ancient woods immediately swallowed. He was a ranger here, a keeper of the peace, though the peace he kept was not the one the brochures promised to weekend campers. It was a colder, older kind of order. He stood 100 feet from the small, squat watchman's shack, breathing deep. The air, thick with moisture and the deep, rich smell of decaying humus, offered only crushing quiet. Birdsong, the skittering of squirrels, the rustle of deer passing through the undergrowth, that was the proper noise of a healthy forest. This morning, there was only the damp, crushing quiet. It was not the peace of deep nature. It was the quiet of a pulled plug. It was wrong, a missing vital sign. Elias began his routine, a slow, physical ritual that demanded focus and punished distraction. He pulled the laces tight on his heavy-duty leather boots. The stiffness of the aged material protested slightly. He felt the dull, familiar ache in his calves and thighs, a comfortable protest from muscles hardened by yesterday's long patrol. This pain was an anchor, rooting him in the mundane reality of gravel trails and boundary markers. He checked his gear with meticulous care. A worn canvas satchel holding an emergency kit, a thermos of lukewarm bitter coffee, and the laminated map. The map was his true companion, a sheet of synthetic paper bearing blue lines marking approved trails. He knew every twist of every path, but it was the pencil marks, his own sharp annotations, that held the real information. Where the ground was unstable, where the silence was too deep, the places that were best left alone. The sun made its first hesitant appearance, weak rays filtering through the impossibly dense canopy of towering fir and spruce trees. The light felt synthetic, a pale gold spilling onto the thick emerald moss coating the trunks. The moss absorbed the color, holding it in a dull, sickly sheen. He began the patrol of the western perimeter, moving deliberately, setting his rhythm against the unnatural stillness. The forest floor was spongy beneath his boots, a mixture of needles and rich, dark soil. He scanned the undergrowth, seeking any sign that the delicate structure of the forest had been disturbed by a deliberate, destructive force. There was no sound, only the faint, abrasive rub of his own uniform jacket, heavy damp wool smelling faintly of stale pipe tobacco. He kept his hands out of his pockets, forcing them to remain open, receptive. He listened with his skin, waiting for the subtle shift in the air pressure, the fleeting cold spot that signaled an approach. He reached the boundary line, a stretch marked by a low ridge of basalt boulders. They were ancient, scarred by centuries of weather, solid and immovable. Except for one. Elias stopped, his breath catching slightly. The dread he had anticipated now confirmed. A boulder the size of a small car lay fractured. It was not split by frost or lightning, but burst. The broken edges of the stone were incredibly sharp, impossibly clean, severed from the inside by a massive contained pressure. He knelt, the damp earth cold through the heavy denim of his trousers. He ran his gloved fingertips along the fresh fracture. The stone was unnaturally cold, a sharp, penetrating chill that went deeper than ambient temperature. It felt like something that had been flash frozen, then ripped before it had time to warm. The fragments lay scattered in a precise, almost surgical pattern. This was not geological. This was agency. He rose slowly, brushing the grit from his hands, feeling the tension, a tight metallic wire, start to wind beneath his ribs. He studied the surroundings. No scuff marks, no drag lines. Nothing suggested what massive force caused the event without leaving secondary signs of struggle. The forest was too neat around the destruction. Elias returned to the shack, the short journey feeling suddenly long and heavy. He sat at his crude wooden desk, pulling out his work journal, a thick ledger bound in black oilcloth. He maintained it with the meticulousness of a librarian, every entry dated, timed, and noted in precise uniform handwriting. Today's entry was brief but damning. 6:45 a.m. Western boundary breach confirmed. Basalt mass at the fourth marker fractured. Cold signature noted. Forest sound profile. Unhealthy silence persists. Prepare for adjustment. He capped his pen, the small plastic click sounding deafening in the shack's small space. He looked down at his hands resting on the ledger. They were the hands of a working man. Knuckles thick, nails blunt, skin weathered. Ordinary hands, but beneath the skin, the deep, slow, irresistible process was already beginning. The muscles were tightening, the tendons shortening. Soon that comfortable ache from the morning would be replaced by a profound, agonizing stretching. It was his physiological schedule. The sun rose, but the shadows lengthened, and the silence outside the shack was not an absence of sound, but an intentional, profound holding of breath. He knew what waited for him. He only hoped he still had the discipline to meet it. The light outside shifted from weak gold to hazy silver. Night was coming. The heavy feeling in his stomach was the dread of the human, knowing what the animal must do. Elias closed his eyes and began the slow, internal preparation for the inevitable unraveling of his human self. The transition from dusk to true darkness was rapid and merciless in the deep woods. By 11:30 p.m., the moonlight, a thick, buttery yellow wash, barely penetrated the foliage, leaving the watchman's shack isolated in a sea of shadow. Elias stood inside, surrounded by the ordinary clutter of his human life. Canned goods, a rack of heavy parkas, the glint of a rifle barrel leaning against the wall. These were the props of his disguise, soon to be abandoned. He worked methodically. The heavy wooden door was secured with 2 thick deadbolts and a stout crossbar he had installed himself years ago. He valued solitude now more than ever, and during the hours of necessary absence, the barriers had to hold. He stripped slowly, peeling away the layers of the ranger uniform. The heavy boots, the thick wool shirt, the denim trousers, all folded neatly on a sturdy wooden chair. Precision was paramount. When the light returned, he needed to return to his human self quickly, smoothly, without the psychological stress of searching for scattered clothing. His mind was the lock. His clothing was the key to re-entry. The air in the small room grew thick with anticipation, though the temperature remained a cool 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The waiting was the crucible. His flesh was inherently resistant, programmed for stability, and the command to change had to be delivered with unyielding mental force. The pain began not as a sharp injury, but as a deep, resonant vibration in the marrow of his bones. It was a dry, internal grinding, the soundless crunch of structure being pulverized and reassembled. He clenched his jaw, refusing to make any sound that might betray his location, even though he knew he was miles from any listening ear. His muscles seized, cords of painful, taut tissue contracting rapidly. Sweat beaded instantly on his forehead and chest, thick and hot, only to evaporate almost as quickly under the intense heat radiating from the core of the change. A sharp metallic scent, ozone, raw copper, and the salt tang of blood flared in the air as small tears began to appear across the skin of his forearms and torso, opening pathways for the growth that was surging forward. It lasted precisely 17 minutes. He counted them, using the agony as a stopwatch. When the transformation settled, the immediate pain subsided, replaced by a profound sense of heavy, dense power. The floor felt cold beneath the thickly padded soles of his new feet. He was taller, heavier, his new musculature a rigid shell of necessity. He adjusted to the new sensory input. Human vision was dull, blurry. This vision was sharp, monochromatic, focusing instantly on thermal signatures and minute movement. Colors retreated, becoming muted earth tones, but detail exploded. He saw the microscopic texture of the dust motes hanging in the air, the faint, branching veins in a discarded pine needle. Sound was no longer a mix of sources. It was a calibrated map. The wind moving through the shack's chimney was a low hum. The microscopic movement of insects in the wall was a rapid drumming. Every rustle was a coordinate. He stepped outside. The cold night air hit him, clean and bracing. The scent of diesel and pine were overwhelmed by 1,000 other signals. The faint, warm trace of a field mouse 30 feet away. The cool, inorganic scent of the broken basalt from hours earlier. He was fast. Unbelievably fast. The forest blurred as he moved, a dark streak of fur and muscle. The ranger's laminated map, now useless, was replaced by a neurological network of scent trails and heat lines. He sought the violation. He ran low, close to the earth, toward the point where the basalt boulder had been destroyed. He moved through a stretch of swampy ground, low-lying muck where the stagnant water smelled faintly of sulfur and rotting vegetation. Even the largest moose avoided this patch. He stopped abruptly, his body coiling tight. There they were, pressed into the thick, dark mud of the bog. They were not the tracks of any known terrestrial animal. They were not five-toed like a human or a bear. They were not cloven like deer or boar. They were deep, sunken indentations, 3 long, slender marks radiating from a central point, pressed down with immense, focused weight. They looked less like prints and more like ancient, deliberate script, etched into the earth by a stylus of tremendous pressure. He lowered his massive head, inhaling the signature. The normal swamp stink, mud and mold, was overlaid by something profoundly wrong. It was metallic, sharp, like old, oxidized copper mixed with the smell of high-voltage electricity, and something else, a chemical scent, sterile and non-organic. This was the scent of the intrusion. This was the sign that the things he hunted were back, not in the disorganized manner of predators, but with the chilling precision of a construct. The beast inside felt a surge of predatory satisfaction, a hunger that transcended flesh and blood. But the core of Elias, the disciplined ranger, held the animal back. He studied the tracks. They moved with a disturbing linearity, focused on a singular objective. They were not hunting food. They were performing an operation. Elias began to track, moving parallel to the prints, careful not to disturb them. The forest was silent, watching, and he knew that the thing that moved ahead of him, leaving that signature of spoiled metal and ozone, knew exactly what he was. The pursuit deepened into the heart of the forest, an expanse of territory known simply as the Barrens, a region too high, too rocky, and too densely packed with old growth to ever be properly logged or patrolled by foot. It was here that the rule of man ended, and the true laws of the woods began, though even the natural laws seemed to bend and break under the influence of the metallic scent. Elias followed the spoor with relentless, fluid motion. Every step was calculated, the shift of weight perfect, allowing him to glide over broken ground and slick moss without sound. He was an extension of the night, a heavy shadow defined only by the intensity of his focus. The terrain grew visibly corrupted. The normal cycle of life and decay had halted. He passed through patches of undergrowth where the ferns and low brush had been desiccated, bleached of chlorophyll, turning brittle and gray. When his foot disturbed them, they produced a dry, grating noise, like the scraping of sandpaper against bone. The leaves smelled of dust and mineral depletion. The forest was being stripped of its vitality. The metallic, oxidizing stench grew stronger, a thick chemical cloud clinging close to the ground. It was the calling card of what he internally referred to as the concentrated non-animal substance. The concentrated, non-animal substance of the creatures. It was the smell of unnatural order imposing itself upon chaos. The beast within Elias pulsed with tight, burning anticipation, a raw demand for confrontation and action. But the ranger's mind, layered over the animal hunger like cold steel armor, insisted on patience. Impulse was defeat. He had to map the enemy's movements, understand its vector, and locate its vulnerabilities before striking. The dense, searing wave of controlled rage beneath his fur was the engine of his movement, but control was the gear shift. He arrived at a small clearing, ringed by moss-covered glacial erratics, massive stones left behind by ice millennia ago. The clearing was unusually bright, bathed in the sickly yellow moonlight. In the center lay a deer carcass. He stepped outside. The cold night air hit him, clean and bracing. The scent of diesel and pine were overwhelmed by 1,000 other signals. The faint, warm trace of a field mouse 30 feet away. The cool, inorganic scent of the broken basalt from hours earlier. He was fast. Unbelievably fast. The forest blurred as he moved, a dark streak of fur and muscle. The ranger's laminated map, now useless, was replaced by a neurological network of scent trails and heat lines. He sought the violation. He ran low, close to the earth, toward the point where the basalt boulder had been destroyed. He moved through a stretch of swampy ground, low-lying muck where the stagnant water smelled faintly of sulfur and rotting vegetation. Even the largest moose avoided this patch. He stopped abruptly, his body coiling tight. There they were, pressed into the thick, dark mud of the bog. They were not the tracks of any known terrestrial animal. They were not five-toed like a human or a bear. They were not cloven like deer or boar. They were deep, sunken indentations, 3 long, slender marks radiating from a central point, pressed down with immense, focused weight. They looked less like prints and more like ancient, deliberate script, etched into the earth by a stylus of tremendous pressure. He lowered his massive head, inhaling the signature. The normal swamp stink, mud and mold, was overlaid by something profoundly wrong. It was metallic, sharp, like old, oxidized copper mixed with the smell of high-voltage electricity, and something else, a chemical scent, sterile and non-organic. This was the scent of the intrusion. This was the sign that the things he hunted were back, not in the disorganized manner of predators, but with the chilling precision of a construct. The beast inside felt a surge of predatory satisfaction, a hunger that transcended flesh and blood. But the core of Elias, the disciplined ranger, held the animal back. He studied the tracks. They moved with a disturbing linearity, focused on a singular objective. They were not hunting food. They were performing an operation. Elias began to track, moving parallel to the prints, careful not to disturb them. The forest was silent, watching, and he knew that the thing that moved ahead of him, leaving that signature of spoiled metal and ozone, knew exactly what he was. The pursuit deepened into the heart of the forest, an expanse of territory known simply as the Barrens, a region too high, too rocky, and too densely packed with old growth to ever be properly logged or patrolled by foot. It was here that the rule of man ended, and the true laws of the woods began, though even the natural laws seemed to bend and break under the influence of the metallic scent. Elias followed the spoor with relentless, fluid motion. Every step was calculated, the shift of weight perfect, allowing him to glide over broken ground and slick moss without sound. He was an extension of the night, a heavy shadow defined only by the intensity of his focus. The terrain grew visibly corrupted. The normal cycle of life and decay had halted. He passed through patches of undergrowth where the ferns and low brush had been desiccated, bleached of chlorophyll, turning brittle and gray. When his foot disturbed them, they produced a dry, grating noise, like the scraping of sandpaper against bone. The leaves smelled of dust and mineral depletion. The forest was being stripped of its vitality. The metallic, oxidizing stench grew stronger, a thick chemical cloud clinging close to the ground. It was the calling card of what he internally referred to as the concentrated non-animal substance. The concentrated, non-animal substance of the creatures. It was the smell of unnatural order imposing itself upon chaos. The beast within Elias pulsed with tight, burning anticipation, a raw demand for confrontation and action. But the ranger's mind, layered over the animal hunger like cold steel armor, insisted on patience. Impulse was defeat. He had to map the enemy's movements, understand its vector, and locate its vulnerabilities before striking. The dense, searing wave of controlled rage beneath his fur was the engine of his movement, but control was the gear shift. He arrived at a small clearing, ringed by moss-covered glacial erratics, massive stones left behind by ice millennia ago. The clearing was unusually bright, bathed in the sickly yellow moonlight. In the center lay a deer carcass. It was a young buck, taken the day before. It was intact. No predator had torn at the flesh. No scavenger had begun the necessary work of breaking it down. Yet it was wrong. The body was pale, almost white, sunken and collapsed. The meat was utterly devoid of color. Elias approached slowly, recognizing the pattern of consumption. The creatures did not eat protein. They did not require nutrients in the traditional sense. They consumed essence, the chemical vital force, the energy signature of life. He nudged the carcass with his foot. The bone beneath the skin was shockingly fragile, crumbling inward like dry paper. This was not food waste. This was processed, neutralized biological matter. He straightened, scanning the periphery, his movement sharp and swift. The creature had paused here, and that meant it was observing or recharging. He lifted his gaze to the highest point he could reach, the crown of an immense centuries-old balsam fir whose peak stood a solid 150 feet above the ground. The moon broke free from a fast-moving cloud, illuminating the very tip of the tree. In that momentary flood of light, he saw them. Two brilliant, absolutely black points, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. Eyes. They were perched, motionless, silent. They were not the eyes of a creature hiding, but of a being engaged in focused, unemotional analysis. They were studying him. The black eyes vanished instantly, too fast for any biological predator. They simply ceased to be visible, as if the light source itself had been momentarily extinguished. Elias stood absolutely still, his massive frame radiating heat into the cool night air. The beast felt a cold spike of strategic shift. The chase was over. The game had changed. He was no longer the sole hunter. He was a variable being monitored by a ruthless intelligence. He was a point of data. He stayed in the clearing for 10 full minutes, letting the unnatural silence saturate him, allowing the metallic stench to burn into his memory. He had reached the edge of the physical trail, but the mental trail, the line of threat, now ran straight back to his own sanctuary. He turned and began the difficult journey back, forcing himself to move slower, deliberately masking his speed. The creature was calculating his movements, and Elias needed to complicate the arithmetic. He chose paths of thick, unforgiving brush, scattering his scent deliberately, trying to confuse the clean, logical process of the observation. The feeling of being watched was a physical weight on his back, heavier than his own dense muscle mass. He was merely an instrument, a patrol. Tonight he had drawn the attention of the clockmakers, and he knew that the coming dawn would bring no respite. The violation had crossed the line from the woods to the man. The shift back to Elias Thorne, Ranger, was harder this morning. The physical exhaustion was immense, leaving him shaking and damp with cold sweat, but the psychological burden was far heavier. The transformation's retreat left behind not just muscular weakness, but a raw, exposed vulnerability. He was back to being soft flesh, dependent on simple mechanics, bolts, engine, eyesight. He sat on the edge of his cot at 4:30 a.m., still dizzy. In previous hunts, the return to human form brought the sterile satisfaction of duty discharged. This morning there was only paralyzing tension. He knew why. His senses, honed to razor edges during the night, had registered the subtle anomaly just before dawn. The soft earth near the edge of the tree line where he had entered the shack showed disturbance. His massive, three-toed tracks were gone. They had not washed away by rain, nor naturally eroded. They had been meticulously wiped smooth, the work of a broom or a flat, precise implement, erasing evidence with chilling deliberation. They were not just studying his habits. They were assessing his capabilities and deliberately hiding their own action. He spent the morning running the usual, dull checkpoints, but the normalcy felt thin, a fragile pane of glass about to shatter. He mounted his battered utility quad bike, the small engine roaring to life, its noise a welcome disruption to the oppressive silence of the forest. He rode the well-worn dirt access road that cut through the center of the reserve, ostensibly checking for fallen branches. About half a mile from the shack, Just where the road crests a small rise, he saw it. It lay directly in the center of the muddy track. A small stone, perhaps 2 inches across. It was obsidian, a volcanic glass that did not occur naturally in this sedimentary region. It was perfectly smooth, polished to a mirror sheen, its facets impossibly sharp. It held no tool marks, yet it was manufactured. Elias stopped the quad, letting the engine idle noisily. He stepped off and bent, careful to touch the stone only with the thick leather of his work glove. It was ice cold, carrying the residual chill he had felt in the fractured basalt. He picked it up. The surface was so perfectly reflective that it caught the hazy morning light and bounced it back into his face. For a disconcerting second, it did not feel like he was looking at a stone. The stone looked at him, a compact lens analyzing his human form, cataloging his movements, his breathing, the slight tremor in his hand. He put the piece of obsidian in a plastic sample bag and zipped it into a secure pouch. It was a message. "We see your day self." The pattern of the creature's strategy was now horrifyingly clear. They were not just reacting to his nighttime patrols. They were integrating his routines into their tactical plan. The time he took for coffee, the precise speed of his quad bike, the places he paused to relieve himself, every predictable rhythm of Elias the Ranger was under analysis. He changed his routine immediately. He drove the quad only as far as was necessary, then abandoned it, continuing the patrol on foot through the thickest, least used sections of the forest, areas where the metallic stench had been strongest the night before. He did not use his radio, nor consult the laminated map. He was depending entirely on instinct, trying to introduce randomness into his actions to confuse the observer. Passing the narrow, fast-running creek that fed into the reservoir, he noticed the strange hydrographic anomaly. Usually, the main current ran powerfully down the center of the rocky bed. Today, the water seemed displaced, hugging the far bank, shallower near the center. Something immense, invisible, and heavy had walked along the deepest channel, pushing the water aside, changing the riverbed's topography without displacing the boulders. It was a passage marker, a violation of fluid dynamics. The coldness that had begun the day before intensified. It was an internal, existential chill, an awareness that the boundaries were dissolving. Elias felt himself being systematically isolated, divorced from the normalcy of the human world. He was no longer just the warden of the forest preserve. He was the sole targeted variable in a strange, non-organic equation. He recalled the old, rambling stories passed down through generations of rangers. Tales of hollow places, pockets of the woods that were eternally silent and devoid of warmth. Elias felt that sensation closing in on him now. He was not guarding the border. He was the border, and the constructs were testing the integrity of the wall. He walked until midday, the silence dogging his steps. He checked nothing. He simply moved, allowing the dread to pool and sharpen, preparing him for the terrible certainty of the night's work. The fear was a useful fuel, a sharp, cold focus. He knew he was being baited, being drawn out, and that this time the creature would not just vanish into the trees. It would be waiting. The transition of the hunter becoming the hunted deepened, chipping away at the foundation of Elias's reality. The creatures were not just observers. They were active saboteurs of his fragile diurnal peace. He returned to the shack just after noon, intending to eat a cold sandwich and organize his notes. As he approached, he felt the immediate, sickening violation. The front door, which he had secured with 2 heavy bolts and the crossbar, was slightly ajar, maybe a quarter of an inch. It had not been forced, nor splintered, but opened with disturbing finesse. Elias drew his sidearm, the heavy steel a temporary reassurance in his hand, and nudged the door open with his foot. The crossbar lay on the floor. It had not been broken. The metal staple holding the latch plate to the jamb was still in place, but the metal of the staple itself had been cleanly sliced through, yielding without protest. It was the same surgical precision he had seen in the broken basalt, an impossible cut, too clean for a conventional tool, as if the molecule chains had simply been rearranged. Nothing inside appeared disturbed. The gear was untouched, the rifle still leaned in the corner, the bed neatly made. But Elias moved immediately to his desk, heart pounding a dull, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He snatched up the work journal, the record of his human life, his sanity anchor. It was exactly where he left it, but on the clean-facing page, the one reserved for routine calculations of mileage and fuel consumption, a new entry had been made. Not written, but etched, the paper fibers pressed and crushed by tremendous pressure. The 3 thin, elongated signs, the same script he had found in the mud. This was communication. Direct, calculated, and terrifyingly intimate. They knew he kept records. They knew the vulnerability of the paper boundary that separated his 2 lives. The physical act was a challenge. The message was recognition. Elias put the weapon down and replaced the door, securing it temporarily with heavy wood screws, a clumsy human fix against a non-human threat. He assumed the creatures were monitoring him now, capable of operating during the day, crossing the line of his expectation. He left the quad bike parked, the gas gauge untouched, and forced himself back into the forest on foot, abandoning all pretense of a typical patrol route. He sought not fresh tracks, but the places where tracks should be and were absent. He passed the old den of a fox he had known for 3 years. The ground was now sterile. The familiar scent of musky earth and animal waste was replaced by the faint, oxidizing smell of metal, a shadow residue clinging to the air. The soil itself felt cold and inert. The constructs were systematically sterilizing the ecosystem, consuming its life force not for food, but for territory. A change in weather arrived with dramatic suddenness. The sky darkened into a bruised purple, and a heavy, relentless autumn rain began to fall. It was the kind of downpour that soaks instantly, beating down the foliage, reducing visibility to 100 yards, and most crucially, washing the intricate map of scent trails off the forest floor. But the rain only amplified the threat. As the water hammered the earth and filled the air with the clean scent of wet soil, the metallic smell did not dissipate. It became airborne, pressurized, emanating not from the ground but from the very atmosphere. The air itself oxidized, turning against him. The cold, too, became physical, the dampness clinging to his uniform like a shroud, penetrating to the bone. He continued pushing through the blinding rain until the sun began its painful dip toward the horizon. Visibility collapsed into a smear of grays and blacks, and then he saw it. Through the curtain of rain, standing a quarter-mile away on a high knoll, was the old fire lookout tower, a skeletal 100-foot structure of rust and steel cable, long abandoned by the Forest Service. Elias had not used it in a decade. At the very top, in the enclosed cabin, A light was on. It was a small, weak, flickering incandescent bulb, casting a dull, jaundiced glow. It was a beacon. It was a finger pointing. It was an explicit demonstration that they had studied his history, found his forgotten places, and were now using his own infrastructure to mock him. The temperature dropped further, hitting 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but Elias barely registered the cold. The internal heat of his rising dread was sufficient. The day was definitively over. The time for human rationale was gone. The tower was a dare, and he knew he had to answer it. The light in the tower was a constant, irritating spark on the blackness of the tree line as Elias entered the shack for his transformation. The routine was broken. The calmness was replaced by a surging, almost reckless urgency. The creature had invaded his mental space, and the beast responded with raw, focused intent. The agony of the shift was magnified tonight. It felt less like a necessary biological procedure and more like a punishment. His muscles fought the change, protesting the immense risk he was about to take. Bones grated louder, tearing through tissue as if the flesh itself resented being stretched beyond its design parameters. The pain was clean, shocking, and total. When he burst from the shack, dripping water and ozone, the heavy rain had eased to a continuous cold drizzle. The tower light pulsed in the distance. He ran not with speed, but with focused weight, covering the quarter-mile to the knoll in seconds. The ground felt insignificant beneath his padded feet, the old, tangled roots merely texture. His lungs worked like immense bellows, pumping oxygen into the massive muscle groups, fueled by a terrible, controlled fear. He scrambled up the rusted steps of the tower, the metal shrieking under his weight, the sound a violation of the night's silence. The cabin at the top was empty. The light fixture still burned, powered somehow by the tower's long-dead battery bank. Under the flickering bulb, placed with unnerving precision on the fire observation table, was a single, heavy object. A bone. The bone was too dense for a deer, too long for a bear. It was thick, polished smooth, and impossibly heavy when Elias nudged it with a clawed hand. It radiated a faint coldness, the same residual chill he associated with the broken basalt. Next to the bone was a clear impression pressed into the dusty wood of the table. The 3 slender, radiating marks burned into the surface. The heat signature was still palpable, a lingering warmth that contrasted sharply with the tower's damp chill. The creature had waited here, studied him, left its trophy and moved on. The tracks led directly away from the tower, toward the deepest, most inaccessible part of the preserve, the place marked only by blank space on the old laminated map. Elias launched himself from the tower, ignoring the painful jar of landing, and began the pursuit. The air grew heavy and stagnant. He entered a section of the forest where the canopy was so thick, so interlocked, that the ground beneath was perpetually dark and damp. It was a primordial chamber, untouched by loggers or fire, silent and suffocating. There were no sounds of life here, no ambient forest murmurs. The ground was cushioned by centuries of compacted needlefall, utterly sterile. In this timeless space, Elias's senses began to register inputs that belonged not to the world of dirt and wood, but to something older, geological, and profoundly alien. He smelled salt. Not the sharp brine of the ocean, which was hundreds of miles away, but the mineral odor of ancient concentrated sea salt, dried and compressed. And lime. Not the fruit, but the raw, chalky scent of construction, of mortar used to build things that should not exist in the earth. These were the smells of time, not geography, the chemical residue of deep history or alien atmosphere. He moved cautiously, letting the silence press in. He knew he was approaching the nexus, the wound in the world where the creatures emerged. He found it hidden behind a massive, unmoving wall of granite. A fissure. It was a vertical split in the rock face, narrow and obscured by layers of ancient, wet moss. From the crack pulsed a steady stream of cold air, frigid and unnaturally dry. But more disturbing was the sound. It was pitched too high for human hearing, but it struck the massive muscles and thick bones of the transformed ranger with physical force, rattling his teeth. It was a sound like taut steel cable pulled to the absolute breaking point, a grinding, whining frequency that spoke of immense, contained energy. It was the sound of a tear, a rift between the familiar physics of the preserve and the place from which the constructs hailed. Elias stopped at the entrance, his fur bristling, the animal demanding caution, the ranger commanding entry. There was no going back to the shack, no retreat to the comfort of the routine. The light in the tower was a signal, and the crack in the stone was the required destination. He lowered his body, squeezed through the opening, and entered the subterranean dark, leaving the smells of pine and earth behind. Elias forced his bulk through the narrow maw of the fissure. It was a rough berth, scraping hide against jagged rock, but the resistance was necessary. He emerged into a tunnel that immediately swallowed all ambient light and sound. This was no ordinary cavern. Physics felt wrong here, distorted. The powerful beam of his flashlight, which he carried strapped to his chest, dimmed and decayed upon contact with the walls, barely extending 20 feet before being absorbed entirely. His heavy footfalls made no reverberation. The sound was simply muted, deadened by the surrounding material. The passage was claustrophobic, the ceiling low enough that he had to run crouched. He, a creature built for the wide-open woods, felt panic rising, an instinctual fear of being trapped. He ran a clawed hand along the wall. It was not mineral rock. It was coated in something dry and incredibly old, textured like brittle, aged parchment. It was cold and yielding, oddly reminiscent of cured, hardened human skin, leathery, stiff, and utterly inorganic. The scent of the concentrated, non-animal substance reached its climax here. It was a high-octane concentration of metallic oxidation and ozone, so sharp it burned the sinuses, overlaid with a faint, cloying sweetness, like burnt sugar. This was the raw, unmixed essence of the construct, pure, unadulterated order forced upon natural entropy. The hunger within the beast surged, a primal, overwhelming drive to consume this raw energy. Then he heard it. Not footsteps, but a faint, high-pitched shuss. The sound of something light and hard sliding rapidly across stone. The creature was moving. Elias flattened himself instantly against the parchment wall, his massive body becoming a frozen slab of silence. He focused his thermal vision down the tunnel. The construct passed him swiftly, a shape of unnatural angles. It was tall, impossibly thin, its movements jerky but flawless. Its surface was obsidian black, reflecting the meager light back in razor-sharp streaks. It moved without displacement of air, almost weightless. It was heading toward the fissure exit, seeking retreat. Elias analyzed it in the millisecond it passed. It was a construct, a kind of biological machine, not a natural predator. It used speed and stealth, relying on its non-organic nature to evade detection. The ranger's tactical mind took control. He was an expert in the mechanics of the forest. Water displacement, rock erosion, the tensile strength of basalt. He knew this rock was fissured, prone to cleavage. 50 feet ahead, a narrow shelf of basalt jutted from the wall, holding an immense weight of smaller, fractured stone. With a sudden explosive push, Elias sprang forward and struck the supporting stone of the shelf with the blunt, massive pad of his shoulder. He used sheer, focused force, aiming for structural failure. The effect was instantaneous. With a roar like a close-range gunshot, the shelf collapsed, sending hundreds of pounds of rock down to seal the narrow passage. The loud, ragged sound of the rockfall was the first proper echo Elias had heard in the tunnel. The construct was trapped. A sound erupted from the creature, a high-frequency, ear-splitting whine that grated like rusty metal being dragged across glass. It spun and launched its attack. It did not use claws or teeth. Thin, silvery plates, impossibly sharp and fine, extruded from its angular limbs. They moved with the speed of whipcords, aiming for Elias's head and throat. Elias met the attack not with agility, but with brute, disciplined weight. He knew the constructs were brittle, relying on speed, not durability. He caught the flailing limbs, the cold, sharp plates slicing into the thick fur of his forearms, drawing no blood, but leaving stinging, burning lines. His goal was not to eliminate the creature physically, but to immobilize it. The hunger had to be fed through ritual, not mere savagery. He had to bring the creature to the proper stance for consumption. He lunged, driving his mass forward, pinning the construct against the rough stone wall of the tunnel. He felt its rigid, cold body struggling beneath him, trying to extrude more metallic blades. The final phase of the contract had begun. Elias held the creature pinned, the pressure immense, forcing the brittle structure to the point of collapse. The air between them crackled with the intense chemical scent of the concentrated, non-animal substance, now so concentrated it felt like breathing pure ammonia. For the first time, in the harsh, focused light of his own intensity, he saw the creature's face. It was a smooth, bone-white dome, utterly featureless save for a single vertical line running down the center, which pulsed with a soft, sickly internal light. It was a seam, a silent vertical slit, and from it emanated a wave of chilling, purely mental cold, a sense of absolute geometric non-feeling. In that instant of direct physical contact, the proximity of the construct's pulsing energy field forced a violent intrusion into Elias's consciousness. It was a flood of pure, non-linear data. He saw a flash, not his memory, but a scene of immense antiquity. An old man, bearded, wrapped in coarse, thick hides, stood over this very same fissure, which gaped wider in the vision. The man, a figure of profound sorrow and determination, was placing a carefully wrapped bundle into the gap, a sacrifice, a payment, a compact, a balance. The vision stabilized into knowledge. Elias was not an accident of nature. His transformation, his curse, was not random affliction. It was the result of a long-ago agreement. The humans who lived near this rupture millennia ago needed a guardian, a tool capable of crossing the line between the organic and the non-organic, capable of consuming the alien intrusion to keep the forest healthy and the rift sealed. Elias was a piece of ancient living ordnance, designed to neutralize the constructs by integrating their foreign energy, their concentrated non-animal substance, into his own struggling biology. The realization settled with the weight of granite, confirming his duty while simultaneously crushing the last vestiges of his self-pity. The creature beneath him, sensing the distraction, renewed its desperate struggle. One of its thin, extruded appendages slipped free, lashing out violently. It raked across Elias's left shoulder, slicing through the dense fur and muscle. The pain was instantaneous and profound, a burning coldness. He looked down. The wound did not bleed. It sizzled, the edges of the skin turning black and smoking, giving off a sharp, acrid odor of burnt plastic. His power was being neutralized by the construct's touch. He was weakening rapidly. He had to finalize the ritual immediately. The time for observation was over. He shifted his grip, locking his powerful jaws not onto a neck or a throat, for the construct had no discernible vital organs, but onto the area just below the pulsing vertical seam. He felt a fierce concentration of energy there, a magnetic, humming focal point. This was not the bite of a predator killing for sustenance. It was the precise, disciplined grasp of a mechanism engaging a necessary function. He had to break the construct's shell and consume the toxic essence within. Survival depended on it, as did the balance of the forest and the integrity of his human mind. He tightened his grip, ignoring the burning wound on his shoulder, and prepared for the true horror of the meal. The moment Elias's jaws crushed the brittle shell of the construct, the essence flooded his mouth and throat. It was the zenith of the metallic scent, raw and concentrated, forcing the back of his throat open in involuntary revulsion. The substance was not blood or tissue. It was thick, heavier than water, and utterly black, shimmering slightly with an internal, oily iridescence. It felt like drinking highly viscous machine oil mixed with molten copper. The overwhelming taste was a bizarre paradox, searingly bitter, like raw electrical conduit, yet possessing an underlying insidious sweetness, a powerful dopamine hit that bypassed his digestive system and went straight to the cellular level. This was the concentrated, non-animal substance. The concentrated order, the purloined vitality of the forest, distilled into a pure, usable energy source. As he consumed, the chemical fire swept through his massive frame. The burning, smoking wound on his shoulder instantly ceased its sizzle, the dark tissue repairing itself at phenomenal speed. His cells felt intensely compressed, strengthened, recalibrated. The transformation was not simply sustained, it was perfected. He felt dense, heavy, and immensely stable. The consumption brought another wave of pure data, a torrential overflow of cold, stark knowledge. He saw them, the previous guardians of the preserve. He saw their faces, men like him, driven by the same grim duty, and he saw their fate. He saw the times they failed to secure the necessary concentrated non-animal substance, their bodies starved of the balancing agent. He saw them losing the mental battle, their human discipline dissolving under the pressure of the constant, unfulfilled animal hunger. They became wild, indiscriminate beasts, driven only by the raw instinct to consume, turning against the land they were sworn to protect. It was a terrible self-portrait, a terrifying glimpse of his own failure mode. The vision ended with a sudden, violent shift in temperature and sound. A growl. Not the mechanical whine of the construct, but the deep organic rumble of massive lungs. Elias, momentarily blinded by the sheer intensity of the consumed substance, felt the presence before he saw it. From the shadows where the tunnel receded into the deep rock, a figure detached itself. It was immense, even larger than Elias, hunched and shuffling. Its fur was long, matted and streaked with patchy gray like dirty snow. Its movements were clumsy, powerful, and utterly devoid of the cold, strategic purpose of the ranger. Its eyes were the horror, milky white, glazed with an endless, unappeasable hunger. There was no flicker of human reason left, only the raw, blinding impulse of a starveling animal. This was one of the fallen, an ancient guardian who had lost the discipline, lost the ritual, and became the very wild terror they were meant to defend against. The ancient beast moved with a staggering swiftness, driven by the smell of the raw essence. It saw Elias not as a peer, but as a competitor, a massive, muscular obstacle standing between it and the last. Precious remnants of the consumed, concentrated, non-animal substance that coated the floor. It attacked with bestial frenzy, a raw explosion of chaos. Elias met the charge, the full knowledge of his purpose now his shield. He understood his favorite dish was not just a means of survival. It was the active maintenance of his humanity, the ritual required to prevent him from becoming this feral, broken thing. He had to eliminate this predecessor to ensure his own integrity. The struggle with the aged guardian was not a fight between equals. It was a battle between control and absolute entropy. The older creature possessed sheer, staggering physical force, its movements powered by decades of unchecked, wild existence. Elias, powered by the fresh, stabilizing energy of the concentrated non-animal substance, fought with a cold, economical precision. The feral monster reeked of rot, mildew, and lost hope, the decaying scent of a body that had forgotten how to heal itself and was being consumed by its own endless hunger. It clawed blindly, aiming to tear and disable, focused entirely on the raw chemical traces clinging to Elias's muzzle. Elias ducked a sweeping blow that would have taken his head clean off. He used his human intellect, calculating the beast's trajectory and desperation. He was stronger because he was disciplined. The feral creature was weaker because it was only hunger. He began to maneuver, pushing the larger beast back toward the spot where he had consumed the construct. The air near the crumpled shell still held the intoxicating raw aroma of the machine oil and copper. The old monster, driven by the pure, unthinking compulsion of its starvation, immediately became distracted by the scent, its wild eyes fixed on the glistening residue clinging to the rock and the floor. It forgot Elias entirely, dropping its defensive posture as it lunged for the residue, desperate to lick the stone clean. This was the opening. Elias acted instantly. He drove his shoulder forward, using the immense momentum of his body, and brought a heavy, blunt fist down in a terrifying, focused blow against the feral creature's spine, just below the shoulder blades. The sound was a dull, wet crack that reverberated sickeningly in the confined tunnel. The ancient beast collapsed instantly, its powerful legs failing, leaving it thrashing weakly, paralyzed, its milky eyes still fixed in a silent, agonizing plea toward the glistening residue it could not reach. Elias stood over the fallen guardian. There was no satisfaction, only the bleak, profound exhaustion of necessity. The creature had met its fate. It was a failure of the system, a threat that had to be eliminated to protect the entire structure. The human rationale within Elias asserted itself. He was a ranger eliminating an imminent threat to the fragile balance. He looked down at the pathetic heap of muscle and bone. The old one was beyond saving. beyond the reach of the ritual. It had become nothing more than another piece of chaos, another tear in the veil. Elias knew the meaning of this final terrible act. The favorite dish was the cost of his control, the ritual required to sustain the human mind against the raw, consuming hunger of the beast. Eliminating his corrupted predecessor was the cost of his commitment. For the integrity of the forest, the boundary had to hold, and the compromised elements had to be cleared. He turned his back on the immobilized beast and began the slow walk toward the mouth of the fissure, every heavy step measured and deliberate. The consumed power was immense, but the spiritual drain was heavier still. The scent of metal and ozone was slowly fading, being replaced by the returning muted smell of damp earth and deep pine resin. He carried the burden of what he had done, the heavy knowledge that his duty was an endless cycle of terrible choices. He had won the night, but the night was only hours away from returning. Elias emerged from the fissure just as the first hesitant gray of dawn began to paint the horizon. The transformation's retreat was a slow, deliberate regression into pain, leaving him shivering and lightheaded. His body, though rejuvenated by the consumed essence, protested the violence of the change. He felt a dull, insistent ache where his bones had stretched and contracted, and a phantom burning where the construct had sliced him hours before. He was human again, clad in the thick skin of familiarity. His immediate priority was closing the wound in the earth. He spent the next 3 hours in back-breaking manual labor, using the heavy tools he always kept near the perimeter of the shack. Bags of quick-set cement, rebar, and large, irregular stones scavenged from the granite wall. He worked with the expertise of a craftsman and the haste of a desperate man. He sealed the fissure not with clumsy panic, but with the specific, age-old knowledge handed down by men who understood that a physical barrier was the prerequisite for a psychological one. Once the cement was set, he painstakingly covered the repairs with layers of wet moss, loam, and broken leaves, making the wall seem undisturbed, ancient, and whole. He was back in the uniform, seated on the quad bike, when he encountered the encroachment of the normal world. 2 young tourists, a couple in matching high-visibility waterproof jackets, walked briskly down the main access road, looking pale and nervous. "Ranger Thorne?" the young woman asked, her voice high and breathless. Elias put on the mask of the professional warden, a steady, reassuring face devoid of tension. "That's me. Everything all right, folks? You're far out for this time of day. We heard things last night," the man stammered, pulling his collar up tight. "Strange sounds, not like an animal." And then there was this incredible silence, a ringing silence. "People talk about the legends, the strange things out here." Elias smiled, a small, weary curve of the lips. "Ah, the legends. Nothing but talk, friend. You heard some wild coyotes or maybe a couple of bored bears looking for an early meal. The silence you felt? Just the air pressure changing with the rain. We're getting an early seasonal shift." He spoke with total conviction, his words a heavy, calming blanket of rational explanation. He pointed them toward the trail leading to the main parking lot, assuring them the rest of the park was safe and open. His internal awareness was sharp and clear. His favorite dish was the performance of this professional lie. So long as the people believed the forest was governed by coyotes and rain, the critical boundary held. His true work was not eliminating the threat, but maintaining the ignorance that kept the threat contained. He was the last filter between the quiet horror and the ordinary world. He watched them walk away, their footsteps crunching normally on the gravel. They were safe because they were unknowing. Elias looked down at his own hands resting on the handlebars of the quad bike. They were clean, the knuckles no longer swollen, the skin back to its usual tough texture. But peering closely under the rim of his fingernails, he saw the faint residual traces of black, oily grit, the last physical memory of the construct's essence. He knew he had changed. The rational man who calculated fuel consumption had ceded ground to the witness who understood ancient, terrible compacts. But the witness could not survive without the mask of the rational man. He checked the fuel tank, noted the consumption in his journal, and clicked the pen shut. The forest, now bathed in full morning light, looked perfectly normal. Wet pine, moss, rock, a picturesque wilderness. Elias shifted the quad into gear and rode slowly along the trail, performing his patrol. The ranger was moving, maintaining the illusion of order. But the hunter was settled deep within, listening to the heavy, perpetual silence of the woods, counting the hours until the sun set again. The duty was eternal.